Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to come and speak. So I'm Pamela Buchan and I'm a research fellow at Exeter University in the UK in the Human Geography department, and I do kind of marine social science. In a sense, I'm really an interdisciplinary marine science with a background in marine biology and coastal zone management, and I've done quite a few other things like public engagement with science I worked in for quite a long time, and I've been involved in local decision making through fisheries and ports and local government, various other things. So I have quite a sort of mixed background, and that really does feed into the kind of research that I do. So I'm going to talk this morning about the marine citizenship evidence that I have and share with you what I found out from my own research, and also introduce the marine citizenship framework, which is something that I'm currently developing to try and help others to design and evaluate their own marine citizenship activities. So first of all, marine citizenship is exercising the right to participate in the transformation of the human-ocean relationship for sustainability. And citizenship is generally understood as being about rights and responsibilities, but of people kind of as part of society. So environmental scientists are often quite familiar with the idea of responsibilities at the individual level. So things like reducing single-use plastics or our carbon footprint, but also individuals can take action that influence like society's relationship with the natural environment, things like campaigning or contributing to citizen science. What's much less familiar to people are environmental participatory rights, so the marine citizenship rights, and especially in the marine context, which tends to be a bit sort of out of sight, out of mind for people. The three pillars of these rights are recognised by the UN Human Rights Council, and they are access to environmental information, participation in environmental decision making, and environmental justice. So for marine citizenship to be effective for marine sustainability, these rights have to be enabled by the people who have the power to do that. And without accessible marine governance, people are excluded as agents of change. So they're not able to take responsibility. To understand marine citizenship, then, we need to consider it in quite a holistic way, thinking not only about people's individual pro-environmental behaviours, but also the social systems that marine citizenship takes place within. So I'll move first to my marine citizenship research and the evidence that that's produced. This is the framework that I used in my research, and it's aiming to understand not only kind of what it is about marine citizens as people that motivate them, but also what it is about the ocean that inspires action and what happens in society and policy that influences marine citizenship. And I researched active marine citizens who I found through marine citizenship programs. So the people theme was really strongly informed by environmental psychology. It used quite established theories, things like the Schwartz Basic Human Values, Clayton's Environmental Identity Index, and that was there to kind of understand who marine citizens are as people and what motivates them. Then the place theme intersected really between human geography and environmental psychology, and that looks at the human-ocean connection by considering the ocean as a kind of place. And then the policy theme is really a shorthand for this complex external, social, legal, and economic set of influences that surround marine citizenship. In order to make measurements about the relationships between the quantitative variables and marine citizenship, I devised a scoring metric using the data that I collected. This was developed during my PhD, but it's also kind of been further adapted to try and make it a tool that could be applied and modified. The items within it can be modified. So, for example, this year I worked with World Ocean Day for schools, and we've applied it there for young people, but we haven't analysed the data yet. So we'll see how that goes when we get to that point. It's meant to be a fairly simple quantitative tool. I'm going to explain it through because this is something that could be put into practice by other people. There are 5 levels of statements, and these levels move from kind of thin citizenship, which is concerned with private actions and personal impacts, right down to thick citizenship, where actions are more public and there's more focus on societal impacts. So like I say, this evidence, kind of this levels emerged out of the data that I collected during my PhD. And that's because the evidence shows that the more public and social focused actions are more difficult or more costly. People are more vulnerable when they do them. So engaging in these sort of deeper levels means that they're more committed. than engaging at the easier levels higher up. So ideally, there'll be multiple statements in each level, and people are basically asked just to tick a box. It's really simple. It's not like, did you do it X times, or have you done it in the last period? It's just yes or no. Is there something that you tend to do? And then they get a score between 1 and 5. And then what you do is you take a mean. So having multiple items in each level makes it a more kind of rigorous test, and you can do a mean for each one, and then you just add them up. So the score can be between 0 and 15, and that's the score that can then be used if you're doing some sort of, statistical assessment with something else quantitative. You can use it that way. So there's a long-standing perception that education and awareness raising and public understanding will result in behaviour change. And we've had a lot of environmental education that's pursued that. But there's also lots of evidence that shows that these don't actually motivate changes in people's behaviour. So more recently, research has tried to acknowledge the influence of values and perceptions and focus in on kind of how caring can be a positive force for action. But there's also a value action gap, and some of these gaps were evidenced in my findings. So, for example, when I asked marine citizens why they thought marine citizenship was important for marine environmental health, their responses were very much focused on awareness raising, on individual knowledge and applying knowledge to policy, or kind of people taking this personal responsibility. But when I asked them what they themselves did to marine citizenship, they gave quite different answers. These answers were really focused on their feelings for the ocean and not at all on their awareness or knowledge. So there was a gap even in marine citizens who were interested in engaging the public. Similarly, to investigate values, I used the Schwartz basic human values theory, which I'll briefly try and explain. Basically, there are 10 core values, and these underlie sort of all the other values and beliefs that people have, and they're organized in this circle. And this circle is like mathematically calculated. It's not just just a sort of arrangement that someone came up with. It comes out of quantitative data. And they're organized across these sort of 4 quadrants, which are across 2 poles. So self-enhancement to self-transcendence and conservation to openness to change. And the poles are in conflict, so the opposite ends of the poles. So you can't, for example, prioritize having power over other people at the same time as prioritizing universalism, where you have empathy and care for other people. But we have all 10 values within us. It's just that they will be sort of expressed in different ways and different priorities across them. And it's really easy to measure. There's a set of questions called the portrait value questionnaire, kind of like questions. And it's been really well tested. So the reason I use this is because it's been so well used, but usually the focus is on universalism and benevolence, these self-transcendence ones at the bottom right. So I wanted to test all 10. Let's see what else, what other kinds of values and what does that mean for marine citizenship. This is what the data looks like, and you can see, hopefully you can see, so the red line is the sort of minimum, and the green line on the outside is the maximum, and then the blue line is the mean. And you can maybe see a sort of bulge towards the bottom right, which is where the universalism end of things is. So there was an overrepresentation of those self-transcendence values in the marine citizens. But when I looked at the statistical relationship with marine citizenship depth, these were not associated at all. What was statistically significant was the conservation to openness to change pole. So conformity and security both have a negative relationship with deeper marine citizenship, and openness to change stimulation had a positive relationship with deeper marine citizenship. So looking, because I used a mixed methods approach, looking through the qualitative data, it was actually possible to find examples of what kind of the sea life and marine citizenship and the marine environment really means to people against all of those different 10 values. So what I would hope from this is that we can say there will be ways to reach people with all different kinds of value sets if we kind of target our work towards different values and different understandings of the marine environment, expanding out of what we tend to do around being interested in sea life, or kind of the certain ways that we're educating about biology and so on. So if it isn't knowledge or values that are really driving marine citizenship, then what is it? And of course the answer is it is the ocean. So marine citizens talk about the quality of the ocean as a place, kind of its aesthetic, its naturalness. And because of that, litter and pollution really disrupt that view, same as the loss of biodiversity. So, for example, one respondent talked about how she worked diving for many years, and every year there were sharks, and then one year there was no sharks. And that was really jarring and really, kind of resonated with a problem for sea life. Marine citizens also love the sea for its sense of freedom and opportunity. This kind of power of the unknown or always changing is really liberating for some people. And there are no kind of limits to its extent. And also this kind of four-dimensional, thing, it's always different. And so that's really appealing to marine citizens. And then finally, marine citizens talked about the sensory experience of being in or on or near the ocean. So the real materiality or physicality of it interacting with our senses in ways that are just not possible because of that four-dimensional space. You just can't get that in other kinds of environment. So these experiences of the ocean drive emotional connection, and that supports an attachment to the ocean as a kind of place, and that's thalassophilea. So you can have an attachment to like your local place, and that's been really well researched in geography. But I adapted the place attachment kind of measurements to look at the ocean more generally. So people can be attached to their kind of local coast if they live near the sea, but people can also feel an attachment just to the marine environment, no matter where they're from or where they live or what kind of environment they live next door to. And so this is a set of Likert questions again, and you take them all as a kind of collective, you add them up basically and do a mean overall, and that will give you a score that again you can use for statistical tests. And I found that thalassophilea is positively associated with deeper marine citizenship, but it's only a tiny like power of explanation. I don't know whether the audience have experience or not in using statistics, but they are R-squared adjusted. This is like a percent, so that's 4.5%-ish of the variation, kind of the difference in deeper marine citizenship that is explained by that. But this is really common when you're looking at a complex problem. Statistically, if you're doing this in a quantitative way, there'll be lots of different factors that are involved that will explain little bits. What I did find was the most important factor statistically was marine citizenship depth. It was marine place dependency. So this is needing the ocean, having a well-being or recreational livelihood dependence on the ocean. And livelihood was the most significant of all of those. Individually, that's 13% of the variation, which is quite significant. But I didn't have many marine citizens who had a livelihood connection to the marine environment. And those who did, their livelihood was really focused on kind of, like biodiversity, so tourism and visiting the sea, or they were, environmental scientists or something like that. So if the livelihood is more extractive or harmful towards the marine environment, we need to bear in mind what implications that might have for people potentially becoming marine citizens. So finally, I just wanted to introduce marine identity. And this is an identity rooted in how the ocean as a place supports the sense of self, and is a theory really that came out of my data. So I'm not going to talk through this whole thing. This is from my PhD, but basically this is how all the different things that I measured map onto what's called an identity process theory. An identity process theory has these sort of 4 different levels: distinctiveness, continuity, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. So all of the data mapped. And I kind of had this, light bulb moment of, wow, maybe this is it. Maybe this is what is important. And the reason that it's important is that identity has been shown to drive action. So it can fill this gap between value and action, or knowledge and action. When identity is threatened, people need to do something about it, because it makes us feel very uncomfortable if someone's challenging us and our sense of who we are. So the second thing to note about identity is that we have multiple identities. They're dynamic, they're competing for priority at any given time, depending on the circumstances, and they're influenced by social representation. So they're not something we have sort of closed away inside us. It's about the relationship with other people and the social context. So that's important to understand as well, that can change and influence people, kind of like the cultural influences on their identity. And then finally, marine identity isn't necessarily going to relate to being pro-environmental. A bit like with the livelihood place dependence, a marine identity can form kind of around the ocean in any different context. So we can't, it could be, again, extractive livelihoods, for example, where it's a very different kind of relationship. So we can't take for granted that a marine identity will necessarily drive action in the direction of sustainability. And that's another important thing to think about. But what we hope we will be able to learn how to do is how to effectively grow marine identities and develop marine identities in people that are based on a healthy marine environment, so that the degradation of the ocean is then a threat to that identity. So we now know something about the kinds of factors that have a relationship with the marine citizenship. Hopefully you can see there's an amazing opportunity before us as a marine community to try some new things, collect some different data and try alternative approaches to encourage marine citizenship. And the thing I'm doing now is I'm trying to develop this marine citizenship toolkit as a kind of pull down document that, with all kinds of things in it that people will be able to apply, and it's going to be based on this. Now, I'm not very far on it, so it's not going to look as exciting as you might be anticipating, but hopefully this is an opportunity to kind of think about what I'm producing and share any feedback, or let me know if when it's ready you want to have a go at it. So the framework is designed to try and make these research findings accessible so that you're using the evidence, but to kind of create more evidence, right, to evidence what we're doing in practice. And it uses things like, so it has the marine citizenship depth metric, which I've already introduced, and then things like this table. So this one is for values. So it's got the 10 basic human values down the left, a description of what those values mean, and then what the marine context was that came out of the research. So in red, those are the values which don't tend to be as highly represented in marine citizens. So we can view that as a gap. These are people who we might be able to reach if we do things a bit differently, and it would be worth reaching so that we can reach more people. And the way to use this would be to review existing activities to see what values they tap into. So using kind of the marine context, are we reaching these people? Are those people not being reached? And then also to trial then different formats which are targeted at particular value sets, and then to evaluate them over time by using the marine citizenship depth metric, so that you can build up an evidence of base of what kind of thing worked for what kind of people. And then ideally we can all share that knowledge so that many practitioners can benefit from what we each learn. Similarly, there'll be a same kind of sort of description and a methodology for people to be able to apply around place relationships. So things like thalassophilia, marine place dependency, and also place identifications, which is how we understand kind of like the cultural meanings of place. So that this is what I was saying about the social representations. If we understand how people are culturally understanding the marine environment, then we can also use that to tap into what their relationships are with the ocean. And likewise, I really want to develop something around marine identity, which has not been empirically tested. So that's something that I'm going to try and develop as best I can in the toolkit for people to apply. The main thing I think just to mention on that was on the marine identity is to think about self-efficacy, because there's one of the 4 components. This is, I think, really important for marine citizenship because it's about empowering people and people feeling capable and able to make change. So it doesn't have to be that every event would, cover everything, but an event could be designed that's maybe even not really anything to do with marine citizenship, but there's an opportunity to situate it in the a marine environment so that people are developing marine connections while they do it, but also create it so that people come away more empowered. They've learned to do something new, or they feel more capable, and that will tap into different elements of their marine identity and their identity generally. So there's things like that can be considered through this. So just to round off, marine citizenship isn't only those personal actions that people can do to reduce harmful impacts that they have themselves, but it's also about giving people a say on how we use the marine environment. Any project aiming to develop marine citizenship needs to think about the underpinning relationship that people have with the ocean as the starting point, especially when they're thinking about people who are not already engaged with pro-environmental behaviours or environmental citizenship. And remember that identity is a powerful driver of action. It might work both ways. So engaging with people's values and understanding of the ocean is important. And hopefully in the near future, there'll be a nice toolkit to help you to do this. So I would be really interested to hear from you about that. So there's 3 papers that the research is based on, and also there's a webinar that I produced for Prep for Blue, which is aimed at, it's part of the EU mission Ocean, and it's aimed at training, in a sense, training of marine practitioners and researchers. And so these things are all available online and open access. You'll find more detail in some of the things that I've said in that Prep for Blue webinar. And yeah, and that's all for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Pamela. That was really, really great. I'm going to open the floor for questions. Does anybody have any questions for Pamela?
Just trying to work out how to stop sharing. Oh, there it is.
Yeah, it took me a moment too.
It's moved. It's not where it used to be.
Yeah, go ahead, Radha. I see a couple of hands. Yeah,
I
go
can
ahead.
wait. I'm very happy to open the floor to somebody else first. You can imagine that I was going to touch upon thalassophobia for obvious reasons for us. Okay, I will ask my question. Hi, Pamela. It's so good to see you again, even virtually, and hopefully I'll see you again soon. We're not very far from each other technically. I just wanted to ask you, because of course, we work on the thalassophile project with Interchange, and that word is very important and powerful to me. I identify as a thalassophile. And could you tell me, how was it discovering the word? How was it deciding to coin it as a term? I remember I first saw your paper, which I think came out at the beginning of the year, if I'm correct.
Yeah, the one on marine identity did, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I remember reading, and I remember seeing the word thalassophilia, in an academic paper. And I think that's when I decided, oh yes, I'm definitely going to be contacting Pamela.
Oh,
yeah.
That's great. Yeah, it was, so there wasn't a word, like it didn't exist. And I was looking around and I was like, so we have in science similar things. There's biophilia and topophilia. So biophilia is about kind of, a relationship with the living world, and topophilia was, from memory, it's a while ago since I've read this, but it was coined as like an inherent connection to, I think, a kind of African environment. And it was going back to, the origins of people in the African continent, and thinking about like almost, I guess, like a genetic, but something built in about a connection. And I was looking at that and I'm like, hang on a minute, we came from the sea first. Like before we were even humans, we were in the sea. So I was looking for a word and it didn't exist in academia. But thalassophobia came up all over the place.
Yeah,
I was like, that's not right. So that's where it came from. It was funny because one of my examiners for my PhD, she was Greek, and she was like, I totally love this. You've done this. But it made sense. It was delightful to see your project, which was after then, to see that afterwards and be like, yes, other people have found this too, that this is, this is the right word for what we feel. That's
same
this
for me.
General ocean connection.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Anthony, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Yeah, thank you very much. Pamela, congrats for the successful publication of the paper. I know we participated and made some of our little contributions to the paper. I mean, it's quite exciting. Over time, I've been so passionate about ocean literacy. And when I saw your work about marine citizenship, so I was like really amazed, and trying to tie the relationship between marine citizenship and ocean literacy. Which one reinforces each other, or which one do you need to drive citizens to begin to take action, in ocean conservation and protection. So how would you put it? Which one comes first? Does marine citizenship come first before ocean literacy, or we need ocean literacy to get people into marine conservation? Or what are the differences between both of them? Because somehow it seems to like intertwine in my head, and I try to how do you place them side by side, marine citizenship and ocean literacy? Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. So Anthony's a co-author on the paper that we just had published like a month ago on marine identity. So I haven't gone into that in much detail, but do check it out. It's quite a long paper, but it's full of lovely stories. People who are reading it are like, oh, that was so nice. I really enjoyed reading it, because it's a lot of marine stories. So thanks, Anthony. Thanks for the question. And it is a very current question. So I don't feel like I do ocean literacy research. And ocean literacy as a concept has really been changing. So it began quite a long time ago, thinking very much about why does nobody know anything about the sea? It was very much a kind of scientific literacy concept, but recognizing that we were not, in many parts of the world, teaching people about, especially in kind of young people in school, teaching them about the marine environment while we were teaching them about terrestrial environments. And that's, I think, the earliest origin. And as it's developed, it's become much more multidimensional, trying to recognize not only these sort of biological or ecological facts about the sea, but also about the fact that humans and the ocean interact and have a relationship, and that can be positive and negative, that we need the sea to live, that it's a fundamental regulator, and those kinds of things. And then more recently, it's moving again further, and the focus really is marine citizenship and marine action. So this is like Challenge 10 of the Ocean Decade, about what's now called restoring humanity's relationship with the ocean. So really recognizing that those relationships that we have with the ocean are important. And so there's much more recognition in ocean literacy of things like values, how the cultural understandings, like the place identifications. We're not always using the same language because this is so interdisciplinary. People come at it from different places. For me, and this may not be what everybody agrees with, but for me, I feel like ocean literacy is a really super important tool, that it enables people to explore the relationship that humans and the sea have, and to learn how to be effective in their marine citizenship actions. I don't think you can have the most effective marine citizenship if people are not also ocean literate, because that shapes the decisions and choices that are made, and how bigger societal interactions are understood, and so on. So for me, they're integral. So you have to have both. But I can't rationalize ocean literacy as being that step into action. To me, it's like it's a huge, encompassing, important tool that people need to be empowered with, and that carries them forward. But in terms of the actual motivation to go on and use that knowledge and use that understanding for marine sustainability, that, which is what I would say is marine citizenship, then for me, that's where that marine identity bit comes in, which is not to say that ocean literacy isn't kind of crossing over and incorporating elements of understanding about marine identity. But this is really, really correct. I mean, you will know, Anthony, I think our paper is the first paper that really tries to characterize this idea of marine identity. And I know there's some others in the US who are working on how marine identity, might be measured and that kind of thing. So it's so new. So I think we have a long way ahead of us to rationalize what the different terminology is and what goes where. I think the main thing is that we're all on the same side. Like, we all want the same thing, and people need to understand stuff in order to be effective in what they then choose to do. But that internal core, to me, is something ocean literacy can help describe and understand, but not the same process, if that makes sense. It's like almost like three things together: ocean literacy and marine identity, and the action that people take as marine citizenship. That's how I understand it.
Can I just ask a follow-on question, Pamela? So we are about to start, in fact, a marine citizen science project with schools, and although my two colleagues are much more experienced in ocean literacy than I am, I've sort of taken away from what you've said just now, and also as part of the presentation, that we should perhaps start with the teachers themselves and try to support them to find out about how they relate to the ocean, their own identity with the ocean, and then move on to and then try and support them to connect, to find that connection in the kids. I mean, that's quite a big ask, but when you've done training like in the Prep for Blue thing, stuff like that, did you come across any pushback from teachers or from researchers or from different groups about working in this multidisciplinary way and finding out more about yourself before you move on to others or anything like that?
No, I didn't. I mean, the Prep for Blue, we had obviously a bit of Q&A and things at the end. I'm trying to think. I think it was I think it was mostly research. Well, do you know, maybe have a watch and you can tell me, because it was a while ago now and I can't remember exactly what the questions were at the end. I don't think there were teachers in the questions for that. I think they were researchers who were engaged, maybe other practitioners, but I don't think teachers. I haven't had pushback. It's interesting because it's a bit like when I said about when I asked marine citizens and they're like, we need to raise awareness and we need to educate people and it's really important, but I love the sea and that's why I do it. And there's that sort of internal disconnect. And I see that a lot. And I think people hear this research and it so resonates with so many people. They feel, I can see their faces light up and people have this, I'm so lucky to do this work because it just fills people with joy. But there's still this like training that we have, and I had because I was a natural scientist as well. There's training about knowledge and knowledge is science and ecology and and it's very hard, I think, to we're also trained, if you're in a natural science training, you're also trained out, or which I think most teachers who are engaging in these issues are probably coming down the science pathway, maybe not primary, but certainly secondary. We have this training that values are subjective and not important, and we should erode them and erase them and not think about any of those things because none of it is real because it's just all subjective, which of course is kind of madness when we're talking about people because people are full of those things, and to pretend they don't exist and aren't important doesn't, is to miss the things that are the vehicles of what we do and why we do it. So there is that challenge of training and kind of externalizing, I don't know, whatever it is that the way you kind of look at other people and want to educate, it's just not the same as what we're doing inside ourselves when we engage with the sea. So that I don't, so there's no pushback in that respect, but I think the actual translation into practice, I think that's a hurdle to get over. And also we'd have so little sort of evidence to go off around these other ways of educating, right? Other ways of, and of course there's 1,000,001 programs around the world. There are absolutely practitioner-based programs who are looking at this stuff in their way that not necessarily is being pieced together as part of the puzzle. Sometimes it is and just doesn't get the same exposure, people aren't aware of it, or that it's we're doing this amazing thing, but it's not to do with ocean literacy, or it's not to do with kind of, taking responsibility for the marine environment. And I think it's a challenge of getting over existing barriers that people don't know are there, right? That maybe get in the way.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Go, I look forward to your toolkit. Is it coming out quickly? Can we use it?
I wish it was, but I've got so much other work. I'm paid I'm paying myself basically a day a week to make the toolkit till March. So I'm partway through. But one of the things I didn't mention, but I'm trying to build it as a citizen science experiment. So I'm creating stuff to go in it that will enable people to collect data and organize data in a way that's methodical enough it can be deposited and then analyzed as like secondary data. So that's wasn't in the original plan, but has emerged from other stuff I've done and like the work I've done with World Ocean Day for Schools this year. It's come out, and I think we need this, like science needs it and people need it, because we need to try and get this evidence, and the evidence from practitioners that's tied to how did you do it, that's so hard to capture. Just we do it in networks like this, handfuls of us at a time, or tens of us at a time, whereas there's obviously so many people around the world. If we can any way that we can enhance that evidence collection.
Great stuff. Caroline, you've raised your own hand.
I've raised my own hand, yeah. I mean, I saw the prep for Blue presentation. That's why I was like, we need to have her here for deep network things as well. And I love how when you were just mentioning with how you need these three, you need the ocean literacy and the ocean citizenship and then the action thing. And it brings together so many points, because we've been presenting that we have a citizen science project as well. And there we talk about kind of these learning dimensions, and it's exactly what you're saying, just they have different names for it. So you have 3 different, to really kind of get this sustainable development within education, you need these 3 learning dimensions. And you have the cognitive, which is then the ocean literacy that you were talking about, the social and emotional ocean citizenship, and then the action, the behavioral change. And that it's this UNESCO 2020 roadmap that they have, and that with with these three in harmony is where you really start seeing the change. And so for me, it's just to hear you say exactly the same thing in different words. It kind of gives like a positive, notion, like a positive movement, let's say, that we're moving in this direction with these kind of things.
I think that's right. We're using the same words in all these, because I shouldn't say this, it's like bad scientists, but it's kind of intuitive. Like a lot of it's not the same as putting the theory around it and so on, but a lot of it is kind of intuitive, provided we trust ourselves to not feel it has to be boxed into this kind of natural scientific framing, which is also important. I should say I'm definitely not trying to diminish that natural scientific knowledge. We should know more about the sea. But yeah, it is a bundle of things that need to come together for sure.
Yeah, and I think you really nicely put that together, kind of how we need to incorporate all of that. I do have a question on when you say that you, like, how do you, when you, for your reach, when you kind of do these questionnaires or these activities, how do you evaluate then that you reached these specific communities or these specific places? Like, how do you evaluate that?
Because that's not what we're at yet. Like, we haven't done that yet.
Okay.
So in my mind, because it would depend on it has to be designed basically for the activity and context. So this is why it's quite difficult to create a pro forma questionnaire or something. It needs to fit the activity. So if for example, you look at the values set, and there was the one, there's the ones that are quite common, so we know that we're probably reaching them, or they're already engaged in that way. And then there's the ones that are not so common in marine citizens, so these are a target because they are values that are more difficult. So the way that I would do it would be, I would be thinking about the activity I'm going to do. I'm trying to think of like hypothetical examples to give you something. I can't pull one out of my brain, but practitioners maybe think about the things that you do and try and translate it. So I would be looking at the activity I already do, say, and thinking about who am I reaching. So in that table, it has this descriptors of like the sort of marine relationships with those particular values. So I'd be thinking it'll be obvious that I'm meeting it. So say I'm organizing a beach clean, I will be meeting people who prioritize universalism and benevolence values, because that is what the beach cleaning is. But there'll be other situations. Say I went to a sailing event or something, those sailors will have different kinds of value sets, and some may prioritize those and some may not. So but that connection is with the sailing, so the understanding what those connections are. So in some situations, it might be that there's a really good understanding of the people that come to the thing, whatever the kinds of events are that you want to catch people in. And so you may be able to look at that and say, well, I know that those people are engaging in this way, but these other people that we also know come, and we know why they come, say it's in a science centre or something, we know why they come, and it's a different motivation. So it would be looking at that motivation and saying, well, I think this is broadly fitting these values, or this area of values. What do we know about how those values interact with marine citizenship in the sea? And then looking at that and thinking, well, what can we design differently? How can we do something? And then in terms of the measuring, we need to measure marine citizenship depth, right? So the idea of that metric is that it's dead easy. It's just a list of questions that are yes, no, which is why I try to make it as easy as possible. So you might tweak the statements. So for example, if you were, again, let's say a sailing audience and you were working with sailors, you might change some of the items or only include items that relate to sailing and activities that are to do with sailing. So it might be to do with maintenance of boats, or it might be to do with harboring and anchoring and berthing, or it might be to do with throwing litter out at sea, or whatever it might be. You would write those statements that fit the levels on the marine citizenship score so that it's relevant, and then you would just ask them, and you would ask them every time, because they just tick yes, no, yes, and they just tick it, and it's dead quick. So you could do that every single time you do an event. You could do it before, you could do after, and this isn't going to be longitudinal data, although it might be if you do a program that's, say, a schools program with the same class for 2 years or something. You could do it as a longitudinal thing. But generally, the idea is the more data we get, then the more we can begin to see the patterns in it coming from different contexts. But the important part is to be able to classify it against the different things. And then if you were like, oh, this didn't seem to really reach people, it hasn't, the before and after, or it doesn't look like they've really thought differently. And you obviously can add other questions in, right? You can ask your own evaluation questions that are not necessarily to do with that. And you can ask intention questions as well, which are, so intention would be like, you know, I care more about, I would intend to do something, I think it's important to have a campaign, or, you know, or whatever it might be. I focus on the action because that's what's so hard to measure. It's a lot easier to measure intention because that's not the same thing as action, but you can still look at moving. It's still important, the intention's part of it. So it doesn't have to be, you know, a perfect scientific experiment, but it can, there's things from this that can be included to then design. So then you evaluate it against the thing you set out to do. So I set out to meet this value. Did this work to meet that value? And yeah, and then and then if it did, fabulous, we've got a new, you know, a new piece of learning about how that worked. And if it didn't, we go back and reflect. But also it could be used across a whole program. So it might be that you just use it more to sort of, we're doing a big public program, so we realize we're only actually, in the different ways we're doing it, meeting certain values, or we're not doing anything about place. So now we can build some extra things into it, and then we can, you know, reflect, does that change how people interact in future? Does it, you know, does the feedback that we're getting on that event show that there's a, you know, a response to that new way of doing things? It's very qualitative. I mean, you could do a portrait value questionnaire. It exists online and it's dead easy to do, but people probably don't want to fill it in on every event to like assess them. But if you're doing a big program with the same group of people, it could be worth doing that just for the sake of getting a measure of who are the people that are coming to it. And then you might say, oh, we're missing people. How can we get them? Or, you know, sorry, that was a really long and woolly answer because it's quite difficult to give a specific. I don't know if that was helpful or not.
Definitely. Thank you. Question, Radha.
Could I chip in very quickly? Actually, it does relate to both your point, Caroline, about the dimensions, the dimensions, and of course, everything that you said, Pamela. It had to do with, we discovered, and Caroline, you probably have to define this better than I will right now. We discovered that indifference was higher, or more people reported indifference rather than more of a positive or negative relationship. And when you talked about, and there was a beautiful slide where you showed what was significant, what was not significant, or what was negative and what was positive. And the negative, of course, things that impact the marine identity, marine citizenship, are sort of that, I guess, more emotional way of looking at things, which is, did I explain that right, Caroline? Would you be able to actually say exactly what that was with the indifference? Because I don't remember how to define it better.
Yeah, no, that was it's a study by Kasha et al. From 2020 or 2022. And they asked, it was related to climate change, and they asked Europeans what their, how they felt about climate change. So a bunch of different questions. And then on a graph, they have then people who don't care, or people who are negative, have negative feelings about it, this topic, and then to positives. And basically 42% pure indifference, like just not thinking about it. And the type of questions that they had, it's just something that isn't a part of their life. They don't have a second thought about it. It's not even that they think it's fake or anything. Yeah. It's just that they don't think about it. And so that's quite, in a way, disheartening to see sometimes. But that's the kind of, I think, the fight that maybe we all have in this audience, is to, how do we reach those indifferent people and move them a little bit more towards the active and positive side of things. Yeah.
I mean, that's really important. But the good thing about indifferent people is they're not opposed. But this is, they have to be moved, right? So I would say in the marine context, indifferent people have not connected with the marine environment in a way that generates those feelings. And there'll also be people who you will never reach everybody, right? We'll never turn everybody into the people we might wish they might be when it comes to the marine environment. That's also not possible. But from a kind of like political, and because the citizenship and the rights and so on, this is really a political concept in many ways. From that perspective, if you're in a democracy, at least, you only need a majority, and indifferent people will often just go with the flow. You know, they're not going to stand up against it. So it certainly doesn't mean we should ignore indifferent people, because they're not, you know, they're not opposing vocally and causing us difficulty. No, but they're the people who just, I think, would be more easily brought into it if they're enabled to have those experiences. So I mean, I haven't gone into all of this, but things like developing experiences early in life. We had this, so from the PhD and with some collaborators, we set up this idea called the Motion for the Ocean, which is like a local government level campaign in a sense, where it's a bit like the climate emergency declaration. So councils can pass this set of pledges to say that they will do things at the local scale, because that is a good scale for kind of democracy and visibility and decision making and things. But one of the pledges in that is about giving first-hand experience of the marine environment to primary school children. Even in coastal towns, that doesn't necessarily happen. So trying to do that, and trying to do that in ways which are associated with sort of, you know, environmental sustainability rather than just the great pleasure, but a bit of both, is, you know, that's a good starting point to get people, to give them, to move them from indifference towards connection.